From New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, this is Democracy Now!
There's no question there's been serious de-escalation efforts. You see it, these videos we've seen lately, one of which was particularly heinous, and I was very critical of what happened there, and the officer has been placed on modified duty and is facing discipline.
Black and brown communities are being disproportionately targeted and policed in New York City's response to the spread of COVID-19. More than 80% of the social distancing violations police issued were to Black and Latinx people. We'll speak with author and activist Jill Nelson, who herself was arrested by police in April for writing "Trump equals plague" in chalk on the sidewalk. The 67-year-old scholar was handcuffed, taken to the police station, and held for 5 hours. Now the so-called graffiti grandma is speaking out. We'll also talk to her lawyer, Norman Siegel, former head of the New York Civil Liberties Union. Then an unusual billboard has been erected.
The Trump death clock is a billboard that hangs over Times Square, and what it shows is an estimate of the number of U.S. COVID-19 deaths that resulted from the president and his team's failed response to the coronavirus outbreak.
We'll speak with the filmmaker and activist Eugene Jarecki about his Trump death clock. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The worldwide death toll from COVID-19 continues to rise, with over 280,000 known deaths and over 4.1 million confirmed cases, though the true numbers are thought to be far higher. The United States leads by far in the number of cases, which has topped 1.3 million, and the number of deaths, which is nearing 80,000. Despite the dire numbers, states across the United States continue to open up their economies. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington again upped its death toll forecast and is now projecting over 137,000 COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. by early August. Director Christopher Murray said some states have moved to open up and are seeing double-digit spikes in their caseloads. This is Murray speaking on CBS's Face the Nation Sunday.
What's driving the change is, simply put, the rise in mobility, and that's the key driver. We're seeing in some states, a 20 percentage point increase in just 10 days in mobility, and that will translate into more human contact, more transmission.
After record unemployment numbers were reported Friday, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin acknowledged the true U.S. unemployment rate could be as high as 25%, a rate not seen since the peak of the Great Depression. Despite this, Mnuchin said Sunday the White House may wait a few weeks before taking up a new round of coronavirus relief funding. In New York, health authorities are investigating the deaths of at least 3 children and a possible 85 cases of severe illness in children believed to be brought on by the coronavirus. New York is also notifying health authorities in other states of the cases. This is Governor Andrew Cuomo.
It's symptoms similar to Kawasaki disease, what they call Kawasaki disease, or toxic shock-like syndrome. This does not present as a normal COVID case. COVID cases tend to be respiratory. This presents as an inflammation of the blood vessels, sometimes inflammation of the heart. It's possible that these cases were coming in and were not diagnosed as related to COVID because they don't appear as COVID.
New York remains the hardest hit state in the United States, reporting over 340,000 cases and over 26,000 deaths. In other news from New York, The Intercept is reporting that Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx is investigating a nurse for sharing footage with the website that shows medical workers speaking out about the lack of protective equipment and other critical supplies they were facing. A nurse in the video blamed the passing of a fellow nurse from COVID-19 on the government's failure to provide them with proper military sources. The nurse under investigation, Lillian Udell, is part of a group known as the Radical Nurse Squad, who are organizing nurses at their respective hospitals amidst the pandemic. In neighboring New Jersey, where half of the over 9,000 COVID-19 deaths have been linked to nursing homes, a veterans home in Paramus is now reporting 72 fatalities, and the number is expected to keep rising. In South Dakota, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe is defying orders by Governor Kristi Noem to remove COVID-19 checkpoints. The checkpoints are set up on highways on tribal land, which Noem says is illegal. Cheyenne River Sioux Chairman Harold Frazier says the checkpoints are the best way to protect against COVID-19 entering the community, which is not equipped to handle an outbreak. South Dakota has also ordered the Oglala Sioux Tribe to remove its coronavirus checkpoints. Indigenous activists say the standoff in South Dakota could have major implications for other battles on tribal land, including the fight to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. Vice President Mike Pence's press secretary, Katie Miller, tested positive Friday for the coronavirus. Miller is married to top Trump advisor Stephen Miller. She's the second person to have a publicly confirmed case of COVID-19 in the White House after news broke Thursday one of President Trump's personal valets had contracted the infection. Ivanka Trump's personal assistant has also reportedly tested positive. Vice President Pence is not going to self-quarantine, despite the fact that she's his press secretary. However, 3 top health officials said they would go into quarantine. Dr. Robert Redfield, head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, FDA Commissioner Dr. Stephen Hahn, and top coronavirus task force scientist Dr. Anthony Fauci. All 3 are scheduled to testify by video link tomorrow to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor and Pensions. Committee Chair Senator Lamar Alexander will also appear remotely after a member of his staff tested positive for coronavirus. This all comes as reports have been emerging that Trump is privately questioning the coronavirus death toll and forecasts. Axios reported last week Trump may start to question official numbers publicly. On Friday, former President Barack Obama blasted the administration's handling of the crisis. Obama was speaking in a conference call with 3,000 former members of his administration.
It would have been bad even with the best of governments. It has been an absolute chaotic disaster.
In California, over a dozen immigrant women have been released from the for-profit Mesa Verde Detention Center in Bakersfield after they held a hunger strike demanding they be freed from the squalid facility during the pandemic. Mesa Verde is owned by the private prison company Geo Group. Meanwhile, jailed immigrants at Northwest Detention Center in Washington state have initiated a collective work stoppage protesting their worsening conditions inside the jail amidst the pandemic. In other immigration news, the U.S. is reportedly continuing deportations to Haiti, with a flight scheduled today with at least 100 immigrants, including 5 people who recently tested positive for COVID-19. This all comes as the Wall Street Journal reports the Trump administration's pushing to expand its latest immigration bans under the guise of curbing the spread of the coronavirus. President Trump's immigration advisors are reportedly drafting a new executive order that would ban issuing new temporary work-based visas for migrant workers as well as foreign students. Meanwhile, 3 more prisoners at the Chino, California facility have died of COVID-19. An earlier death was reported in April. Over 330 cases have now been confirmed at the California Institution for Men in Chino, and at least 44 people have died in federal prisons across the country, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Across Europe, countries continue to relax restrictions as more people return to work and children return to school in some localities. In Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced plans to transition from a stay-at-home to a stay-alert policy starting this week, saying those who cannot work from home should be encouraged to go back. He also said people should have unlimited time outside as long as they respect social distancing rules. In addition, elementary schools could open as soon as next month, he said. Boris Johnson's message was met with disapproval and confusion over its lack of clarity. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have decided to extend their lockdowns. This is Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon.
I have asked the UK government not to deploy their Stay Alert advertising campaign in Scotland. Because the message in Scotland at this stage is not stay at home if you can. The message is, except for the essential reasons you know about, stay at home, full stop.
Britain has the second highest death toll after the United States, with around 32,000 confirmed deaths. Boris Johnson also announced Sunday all air travelers will soon be subject to a 14-day quarantine period when entering Britain. People traveling from France will be exempt after the two nations agreed on a reciprocal arrangement. France has also lifted some of its restrictions as of today and is imposing new measures, including the mandatory wearing of masks on public transportation and in high schools. Some Muslims have called out the government's hypocrisy, since headscarves are banned in public schools and burqas are banned in any public space. In Spain, around half the country is moving to the next phase of a national plan to ease its lockdown. Restaurants and shops can operate at reduced capacity. Museums, gyms and hotels will also be able to reopen for business nearly 2 months after shutting their doors. However, Madrid and Barcelona, Spain's two largest cities, still do not meet the criteria to open up non-essential businesses. In Russia, a fire broke out at a Moscow coronavirus hospital Saturday, killing at least one person. Coronavirus cases continue to surge in Russia. Over 10,000 daily cases have been reported for over a week, with a total of over 220,000 confirmed cases and over 2,000 known deaths. To see our coverage of Russia, go to our interview last week on Democracy Now! South Korea reported 34 new coronavirus cases Sunday, its highest daily figure in a month after a new outbreak that originated in several nightclubs. Seoul shut down all bars and nightclubs indefinitely in response. President Moon Jae-in said Sunday, despite its early success in curbing the outbreak, South Korea is facing a, quote, prolonged war.
It will be a long time before the COVID-19 outbreak ends completely. We should also brace for the pandemic's second wave, which many experts are predicting.
China is also reporting new coronavirus cases, sparking fears of a second wave of the outbreak. Authorities reported 17 new cases of COVID-19 Sunday, including 5 in Wuhan. In Afghanistan, rights groups are calling for an investigation after at least 6 people were killed in a police shootout at a food distribution event in central Ghor province, where protesters were demanding economic assistance and the coronavirus amidst the coronavirus crisis. Around 4,000 cases of COVID-19 have been confirmed in Afghanistan, where testing remains extremely limited. In Iran, a southwestern county has been placed under lockdown after authorities say people failed to observe social distancing rules. In Lebanon, the country's economic crisis is compounding the threat of hunger for Syrian refugees amidst the pandemic. A recent UN survey found 70% of Syrian refugees experienced hunger, while many could not afford to buy soap. The U.S. has blocked a vote on a UN Security Council resolution supporting a global ceasefire over objections to a minor, indirect reference to the World Health Organization. The U.S. said it would only approve the mention of the WHO if the resolution included language critical of the agency and of China in their response to the pandemic. Last month, Trump halted U.S. funding for the World Health Organization, a move widely condemned around the world. In Iraq, hundreds of anti-government protesters gathered in central Baghdad Sunday, setting up barricades and clashing with police, who responded by throwing stun grenades and rocks at the demonstrators. The protest came just days after Iraq inaugurated a new prime minister, former spy chief Mustafa al-Kadhimi, ending months of political deadlock. Over the weekend, he promised compensation for the families of hundreds of anti-government protesters who were shot and killed after large-scale protests erupted last year. Libya's capital city, Tripoli, was rocked by a barrage of missile fire over the weekend as forces aligned with renegade former Libyan General Khalifa Haftar fired on UN-backed government forces, setting fire to airplanes and fuel tanks at Tripoli's main airport and threatening Tripoli's main water supply. The surge in fighting prompted Turkey's government to threaten new attacks on General Haftar's forces in eastern Libya. Back in the United States, Georgia's Attorney General Chris Carr requested Sunday the U.S. Department of Justice conduct an investigation into the handling of Ahmaud Arbery's case. He's a black man shot and killed in February by two white men while he was out jogging. The killers, father and son Gregory and Travis McMichael, were arrested and charged with murder Thursday, 2 days after video of the shooting was released. The father is a retired police officer. They said they hunted Arbery down because he looked like a burglary suspect. Rights groups and some Georgia lawmakers are calling for the urgent passage of a hate crime bill. Georgia is one of 4 states that does not have hate crime laws. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms called the killing a lynching. This is Mayor Bottoms speaking on CNN Sunday.
With the rhetoric that we hear coming out of the White House, in so many ways, I think that many who are prone to being racist are given permission to do it in an overt way that we otherwise would not see in 2020.
Protests took place in Glynn County, Georgia, and around the country Friday on what would have been Ahmaud Arbery's 26th birthday. And in Missouri, a black transgender woman was found stabbed to death in her home last week in what's believed to be a hate crime. 28-year-old Nina Pop is at least the 10th victim of an anti-trans murder this year. Transgender rights groups are renewing calls for Missouri lawmakers to pass legal protections for LGBTQ residents, including the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, which would add sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of protected groups in the Missouri Human Rights Act, but has failed to pass the state legislature for over 20 years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to look at how black and brown communities are being disproportionately targeted and policed in New York City's response to the spread of COVID-19. And it's not just limited to New York. Data released Friday reveals more than 80% of summonses issued by the NYPD for social distancing violations have been to black and Latinx people. And 92% of people arrested for not social distancing are non-white. Images circulated widely on social media showing a spotlight on uneven policing. Some show police officers distributing masks to white residents in crowded New York City parks, apparently arresting no one. Meanwhile, videos have emerged of violent crackdowns on social distancing measures in black and Latinx neighborhoods. Earlier this month, cell phone video went viral showing police officers aggressively pinning a black man to the ground as they arrested him, then violently attacking a black passerby, dragging him on the street, punching him and kneeling on his neck during what was supposed to be a social distancing enforcement action. The man who was attacked, the second man, 33-year-old Donnie Wright, was hospitalized with severe injuries to his back, ribs, and chest. The officer involved, Francisco Garcia, has since been put on modified assignment. Last week, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office said 35 of 40 people arrested for social distancing violations were black. Mayor Bill de Blasio has rejected comparisons to New York City's unconstitutional stop-and-frisk policies under former Mayor Bloomberg, but said in a tweet, the disparity in the numbers does not reflect our values. Well, for more on racist policing, we are joined by an author and activist who was herself arrested by the New York Police Department on April 16th. She was writing Trump equals plague in chalk on a boarded-up building in her Washington Heights neighborhood in northern Manhattan. Jill Nelson was handcuffed and spent more than 5 hours in jail before being released. The 67-year-old scholar, writer, and activist, now being called the graffiti grandma, is speaking out against the NYPD. She's a longtime reporter, has written several books, including the autobiographical Volunteer Slavery, My Authentic Negro Experience, which won an American Book Award. She's a former professor of journalism at the City College of New York. Jill Nelson, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, but unfortunately under these circumstances.
Thank you.
Can you talk about what happened to you just under a month ago?
I went out to go to the drugstore and the supermarket, essential trips. I was walking from the drugstore down to Broadway to go to the supermarket when I saw a green, boarded up, empty for rent building It was covered with plywood, and I wrote a piece of chalk in my pocket, and I wrote, "Trump equals plague." Before I could even step back, cops swooped in, cut me off made it up 2 cop cars, cut me off, jumped out. "What are you doing? What are you doing? You're under arrest." They searched me, asked me if I had weapons, told me to take my hands out of my pockets. It was a cold day, so I said no. Frisked me, shoved me into a police car, and took me to the 33rd precinct, where they put me in a cell and left me there for 5.5 hours. I took my shoes off. I had a mask, a fabric mask I had made on, but I demanded that they give me one of their more professional masks. They didn't allow me to make any phone calls. I was never read my rights. It was absurd, absolutely absurd, a total waste of time, energy. And this is in a community that has one of the highest rates of COVID, has many people who are poor and working poor. And there's something the police could have been doing besides attacking me for writing the truth. I have yet to have anyone disagree with what I said.
Let's go back to the beginning. Talk about the building that you were writing on. You were using chalk?
I was using chalk, washable chalk, and it was a boarded up front of a building when you build it out and cover it with plywood as if you're going to renovate, but it had a for rent sign. So it was not occupied by anyone.
And why did you choose that phrase?
Because he is a plague and a pox on all our houses. And
you were writing Trump equals plague?
Trump equals plague, yes. I mean, it sums it up to me, what's going on, how it is, what's happening in this country and in the world. And we have a president who is aiding and abetting and telling us that as people of color and older people, we should just die, get out there and die for capitalism. It's ridiculous. There's so many disparities in healthcare, in treatment, in coverage. You know, I think the police are out of control. I think the mayor is afraid of the police. Instead of saying what he ought to say, which is, now I see how you feel, people of color, he's fronting for the police as always. Apparently, the only person he worries about is Dante.
Dante being his son.
His son.
And why do you say that?
Well, because it's always an excuse. I'm so tired of, I'm 67 years old. I was politicized by the killing of Clifford Glover when I was 18. This notion that it's only a few bad apples and that this isn't policy and that, the police are there to serve and protect. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I don't see it. I can't see how arresting me or rushing down those young men in Brooklyn serves any purpose. It doesn't make us safer. And I frankly feel that COVID-19 has been racialized, really, and it's now being used as a way to further oppress people of color. It's just absolutely wrong. The police aren't doing their job. What a waste. And
so, Jill Nelson,
I think we have to stand up and resist.
So describe what happened when the police moved in on you. You were wearing your mask. Were they wearing masks?
They were wearing masks. They were wearing gloves. They jumped in. I mean, you would have thought I was selling crack in the early 80s. The way they swooped down, it was seconds. They subsequently told someone that someone had called in a complaint. I find that hard to accept. It was between 15 and 30 seconds max between when I started writing and when the cops got there. What are you doing? We're gonna arrest you. Is this your property? Do you know what you're doing? Do you have any weapons? I said words. They didn't think that was funny or intelligent. They cuffed me roughly, shoved me into a police car, took my pocketbook, took me to the station, booked me, and then put me in a filthy cell for 5.5 hours. I wasn't read my rights. I wasn't offered the right to make a phone call.
You weren't able to make a phone call?
No. Eventually, I'm sorry, at 3 o'clock, this was after being there a couple of hours, they told me I could call and try to get my husband because I didn't have a photo ID and they needed that to release me. But they dialed my home number. When my husband answered, the guy after 50 seconds the cop says, I'm going to cut you off. After a minute, boom, cut me off. So my husband had no idea what precinct I was in.
You hadn't gotten a chance to say where you were yet.
No, and they had told me that to tell him that they would send a cop car by my apartment, which is like, 10 blocks away, to pick up my ID. My husband put my license in an envelope, went downstairs and waited for 40 minutes. And they never came to get it. Then he came back upstairs, figured out where I was, came to the precinct, dropped off my ID. I didn't even know that until I happened to see my identification in a plastic evidence bag and was like, has my husband been here? Where is he? And they were like, oh, yeah, he came a while ago. You couldn't have seen him anyway.
Which police station were you being held in? Which community?
The 33rd Precinct in Washington Heights.
So did they threaten to bring you to central booking, to bring you downtown?
Yes, because I didn't have ID, and they wouldn't either go pick up my ID, or I had offered early on, drive me to my house. You can come up to my apartment. I'll give you my ID. They told me they were going to take me downtown, and that if they took me downtown, I'd probably be there all night. And when they finally released me, Amy, the desk sergeant said, and be sure to show up for your desk appearance ticket, or else we'll come to your house and arrest you. The whole thing was...
Jill Nelson, we're going to
ma'am.
break, and we're going to also be joined by your lawyer, Norman Siegel, former head of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and talk about this issue. These are the kinds of issues you write about, not only in New York City, but all over the country. We're talking to the author, activist, former professor, Jill Nelson, 67 years old, lives in the Washington Heights area of New York City, and was handcuffed by police after they moved in on her for graffitiing on a boarded-up building. Trump equals plague. Stay with us.
I hope that I should live to see when every man should know she's free. Present sufferings from the past, I make our hearts a bit of sad. I got my duty rock and roll. Now everybody's gotta be free, y'all. La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. Let's get rid of that old man head and bring our fellow man up today. It may seem very hard to do. Just open your mind, let love come through. You hear me?
Freedom Blues by Little Richard, the man called the architect of rock and roll, died of cancer Saturday at the age of 87. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at how black and brown communities are being disproportionately targeted in New York City's response to the spread of COVID-19, and it's not only here in New York City. We're joined by Jill Nelson, usually writing about these issues, author, activist, former professor of journalism. She was just arrested herself by the New York Police Department on April 16th. She was graffitiing the words "Trump equals plague" in chalk on a boarded-up building in her Washington Heights neighborhood in northern Manhattan. She spent more than 5 hours in jail, wasn't allowed to make a phone call for hours, had to demand to be given a mask. Also with us, Norman Siegel, civil rights attorney who is one of two lawyers representing Jill Nelson. He's former director of the New York ACLU. Norman Siegel, can you talk about what Jill Nelson faced and what you're calling for right now?
Well, we're asking the Manhattan District Attorney, we'll begin some telephone conversations in the next week, to dismiss the charges. We want whatever record exists because of what happened in April to be expunged. We want an apology to Ms. Nelson. And finally, Ms. Nelson has requested a meeting with the precinct commander of the 33rd Precinct in Manhattan so she could sit down and have a discussion with the police commissioner, the police commander, to talk about the affirmative things that the police department can do during the COVID-19 period in the Washington Heights community. Ms. Nelson is an outstanding, as you said, Amy, scholar, activist, and she's giving voice to people who are suffering directly or indirectly similar kind of inappropriate actions by some of the police officers of the New York City Police Department.
I want to talk about some of the disproportionate approaches of the police department and disparate approaches. So you have last week, on the same weekend when police officers were distributing masks to white residents gathered in crowded parks, not involved with social distancing. Pictures were going online. Pictures were going, showing, white people crowded in Central Park. At the same time, you had a different group of New York police officers attempting to shut down a press conference and a protest in Manhattan's East Village. The event was organized by Reclaim Pride Coalition Protest Mount Sinai Health System, invitation to partner with the right-wing evangelical group Samaritan's Purse to open medical tents in Central Park. That happened a while ago. The officers ordered the protesters to disband and gave one of them a summons saying she'd violated social distancing rules, issued in executive orders from the mayor and the governor that ban, quote, any non-essential gathering of individuals of any size for any reason. So you have both the arrests around social distancing and the arrests around protests, Norman Siegel. Can you talk about this?
Absolutely. And it's very alarming because if the mayor of the largest city in America can ban peaceful political protest, it could reverberate around the entire America. Other cities, if they see that New York is doing it, might do the same thing. Political protest is a bedrock principle of American democracy. It's protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And just think, without political protest in the last 75 years, the incremental progress that we have made with regard to race relations because of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, because of the ending of the Vietnam War, the women's movement, the LGBTQ plus movement, the environment movement. Without the right to political protest, people who generally don't have the power have a vehicle to get their message across. And even today, protests that are needed peacefully, with Mr. Arbery in Georgia, that situation reflective of a much more historical pattern of discrimination against people of color and poor people. The idea that the Department of Justice can all of a sudden drop the charges on Michael Flynn. Lots of demonstrations are needed because it's embedded in what American democracy is all about. So when you have an executive order that the mayor is now relying on, that, as you quoted, talks about non-essential gathering of people. And in the governor's executive order, the examples they give are parties, celebrations, social events. Our position very strongly, and we encourage people not only in New York, but all across America to understand what's at stake here. It's the right for the people to peacefully demonstrate. And usually when you're demonstrating, historically as well as currently, who's the target? The target is government officials and government policy. So it naturally follows that the governors, the mayors, would want to ban and suspend political protest. So the bottom line is that when you take a look at Supreme Court decisions, they say that if you're going to have an executive order or a policy, it's got to be content neutral, reasonable time, place, manner. It's got to be narrowly tailored, and it can't be overly broad. So the problem here is that you could have both respect and protect free speech and public health, because you can say that people who want to demonstrate, as long as you're wearing a face mask and you're at least 6 feet apart from the other people, you can have free speech and you won't spread the COVID-19 virus.
Before we talk about the Arbery case, which I want to do also with Jill Nelson, I wanted to compare what happened to her and Central Park being filled with white people very close together. The pictures are everywhere. And yet in the East Village, and this is a video that also went viral, cell phone video showed police officers aggressively pinning a black man to the ground as they arrested him, accusing him of not social distancing, who was talking across the sidewalk to a woman who was at a police booth, and then violently attacking another black passerby, dragging him on the street, punching him. And like with the first black man, they kneeled, this very burly officer, not wearing a mask, kneeled on both of their necks separately during what was supposed to be this social distancing enforcement. The second man who was attacked, 33-year-old Donnie Wright, was hospitalized with severe injuries to his back, ribs, and chest. The officer, Francisco Garcia, has since put on modified assignment. They say they're investigating the situation. I want to get Jill Nelson's response and then Norman Siegel to what is taking place here.
Well, I think that COVID-19 has been weaponized and racialized and is being used to further oppress Black and Latinx people. We have to resist, as Norman was saying. We cannot just sit by and act as if this is acceptable or anything goes to survive. It's not enough to me to bang pots and cheer and clap at 7 o'clock every night. We have to, as Norman said, get out there, demonstrate, and resist this militarization of our city, of our country, and the racialization of this alleged great fight against COVID-19. What's the difference between, and when you look at the pictures that you mentioned, Amy, in Central Park, people are much closer than the people who were beat down in Brooklyn or in Lower Manhattan. It's just absurd, and the mayor and the elected officials need to take a stand. And let me say that I wrote a letter on the 20th of April to all my elected officials and have heard from Al Taylor, my state assemblyman, Gail Brewer, Jumaane Williams. That's it. Where's my congressman? Where's my city council person? Where's my state senator? Nothing.
So I wanted to turn nationally to what's happening in Georgia with Ahmaud Arbery's death. Georgia's Attorney General Chris Carr requested Sunday the U.S. Department of Justice conduct an investigation into the handling of Arbery's case. The 26-year-old, well, he would have been 26 on Friday, 25-year-old at the time, February 23rd. An African-American young man was shot and killed in February by two white men, a retired police officer, and his son. He was out jogging. The killers, Gregory and his son, Travis McMichael, were arrested and charged with murder Thursday, 2 days after the video of the shooting was released. The police department, even the state, had it for months. They said they hunted down Arbery because he looked like a burglary suspect. Earlier this month, the cell phone video went viral showing. So I was wondering if you could also, Jill, this is the kind of thing you write about in The Nation and other publications. What has taken place here? Many people are calling for the arrest of the third person, the one who took the cell phone video, who was following Arbery along, who knew the other two men. But your thoughts on how this fits into what's happening. And interestingly, as the Republican governor, Governor Kemp, opens up Georgia, one of the first states to reopen, immediately hundreds of people protested the death of this young man.
Right. Well, I think it is, as it has always been in America, open season on people of color. And we see COVID-19 and the stress in the nation being used as a cover for that same thing. And Arbery, to me, if his mother and his family had not kept up complaining and demanding action, if people had not immediately come out and begun demonstrating and resisting, this would never have happened. There would have been no arrests. But it ties into these scenes we see of armed white men with swastikas and Confederate flags converging in front of state houses and demanding that governors reopen. I mean, this is the Civil War, which this is just the latest battle.
Final comments, Norman Siegel, on what you feel has to happen nationally right now as states do open up, but this crackdown continues.
Well, first, let me comment. I want to support the family of Mr. Aubery with regard to the call for an independent prosecutor. My experience is that on cases of this nature, which not only affect that family, but are symptomatic of a larger historical pattern that Jill has just articulated, you need to have someone from the outside come in order to get justice. Second, with regard to what's happening right now, my message to people who are listening this morning, and for you to talk to your friends and neighbors, the rebels need to get out and need to be able to protest and speak out, not just online, not just on Twitter, but to make sure you're wearing face masks, you're socially distant, and begin to speak up. Because what I've learned, we don't lose our civil rights and civil liberties with a big bang overnight. We lose it day by day, little by little, and it atrophies. And then one day you wake up and you don't have those rights that you took for granted. So speak up, write, demonstrate peacefully. This is our country. These are our rights, and we have to fight for them because otherwise we'll lose them.
I just wanted to comment that at the same time we're talking about this disparate treatment of people of color and white residents in this country, particularly here in New York City. COVID-19 also does not affect people equally, as we see all over the country. The disproportionate number of deaths in the Black and the Latinx community of those suffering from COVID-19 and contracting it to begin with. I want to thank you both for being with us. Jill Nelson, writer, activist, journalist, author of a number of books, including Volunteer Slavery, My Authentic Negro Experience, and Norman Siegel, civil rights attorney, one of the two lawyers representing Jill Nelson. He's the former director of the New York American Civil Liberties Union. When we come back, a new billboard has gone up in Times Square, the Trump death clock. We'll speak with the man who unveiled it. Stay with us.
An invite to a wedding that no one can attend, a poster for a show that never happened, 2 tickets for a holiday I can no longer spend, a gift for Mother's Day I won't be wrapping. This is all I'm left with in a world that's been shut down. I want to come and see him, but I fear that thing that I might bring in, so I'm sending you this message with a heavy heart to say I miss you, but I can't be there today. I love you and that's why I'm gonna stay away.
Can't Be There Today by Billy Bragg. He released this on Mother's Day, performed, well, remotely for a big city winery event that included Steve Earle, the Indigo Girls, and others. To see Steve Earle's premiere of his new song and his new album, you can go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the death toll from COVID-19 in the United States surpasses 80,000, higher than any other country in the world, an unusual new billboard called the Trump Death Clock has been unveiled in New York City's Times Square. The 56-foot sign keeps tally of lives lost to government inaction. It was created by filmmaker Eugene Jarecki, who writes in the Washington Post that, quote, "It's time for the establishment of a national death clock to measure the cost in human lives of President Trump and his team's reckless handling of the coronavirus pandemic," unquote. White House Coronavirus Task Force advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci has said the virus would have been mitigated and lives would have been saved if social distancing guidelines had been implemented earlier. Dr. Fauci is now one of 3 members of the task force who've entered self-quarantine after possible exposure to the virus by one of several people who've just tested positive at the White House, among them Vice President Pence's press secretary, though Vice President Pence says he will be coming to the White House today. This is Dr. Fauci on CNN last month.
Obviously, you could logically say that if you had a process that was ongoing and you started mitigation earlier, you could have saved lives. Obviously, no one is going to deny that. But what goes into those kinds of decisions is complicated. But you're right. I mean, obviously, if we had, right from the very beginning, shut everything down, it may have been a little bit different. But there was a lot of pushback about shutting things down back then.
Reports show President Trump ignored warnings from advisors and experts as early as January about the need for urgent mitigation measures against the spread of the virus. It wasn't until March 16th that Trump reversed his previously dismissive stance and announced new guidelines. But by then it was too late. Well, for more, we're joined by Eugene Jarecki, award-winning documentary filmmaker, author, activist. He created the Trump Death Clock billboard that was unveiled in New York City's Times Square Friday morning. We will also link to his piece in the Washington Post, Trump's COVID-19 inaction killed Americans. Here's a counter that shows how many. It's great to have you with us, Eugene. Just explain what went into this billboard.
Sure. Well, it started out actually as a website. It wasn't a billboard. It was just an effort on the part of myself and my team to quantify what we were learning from the epidemiologists. And then we got in contact with the leading epidemiologists on whom the New York Times had relied and the British government had relied, Drs. Jewell and Jewell, and spoke to them about their findings. And what we found was that there was an amazing and very dark truth underlying the numbers that spoke to reckless mishandling of a pandemic by the president and his team. And we felt that ought to be quantified. And first it became a website.
So describe the website for us, where it is in Times Square.
So the website itself is called TrumpDeathClock.com, and you can go to it every minute. You'll see it update, and you'll see very tragically the death toll rise that is attributable to the Trump administration's failure to handle the outbreak as they should have. But what was inspiring to me originally, I'm a New Yorker, and every New Yorker knows, and most visitors to New York at one time or another pass the famous debt clock that hangs over the Avenue of the Americas, 6th Avenue. And that national debt clock stands for something. It's symbolic, and it speaks about the country's reckless borrowing. And it warns in a way, just as a symbol, that there will be grave future consequences to that borrowing. Well, I didn't need to look far to see the grave consequences of the reckless handling of this pandemic. And so it seemed to me that in the spirit of the debt clock, there ought to be a death clock, and it ought to be somewhere hanging for the world to see, for the media to see, and to be sort of implanted in our minds, our public imagination, as a reminder of the grave consequences of reckless leadership during a time of crisis.
Tell us exactly the place it is in Times Square, how you got permission to do it, and then how you make the calculation, because clearly the United States would have been affected by the coronavirus, whether it was President Trump or President Obama or the next president.
Yes. So the Trump death clock now lives in Times Square at 43rd and 7th at 1500 Broadway. That's the building that it's at. And, what we found, people read my editorial when I was writing it for the Washington Post, and I showed it to friends and acquaintances who were supportive of what I was thinking, but they're, giving me good editorial ideas. And over time, they said, if you're so focused on the debt clock, why don't you find out about putting a death clock in the real world? Why just do it as a website? And of course, I had thought about that, but I didn't know, my gosh, what must a billboard cost, or a big clock to put up? Well, when we poked around a little bit, friends had offered to give some support. We found that, maybe not surprisingly, billboard space is not very expensive right now, because after all, there's nobody on the streets in the height of a pandemic if people are sort of living by the guidelines that they've been supposed to be under. And that means that billboard space in New York was much, much more affordable than one would have ever dreamt, a tiny, tiny fraction of what it would usually cost to advertise in Times Square. It was one of the most expensive areas of the world. So some friends put together some support to really put it up and start the ball rolling, which we hope will roll across the country. We hope that the Trump death clock in New York can be emulated in small towns and big cities across the country, where people can get a billboard that's sitting dormant, or they can actually just project it. Those little projectors that people have, you can project it on a building, you can project it on your house, just to remind your community of what the incredible cost has been of the reckless handling of this. And this is not just about being critical. As you say, this could have happened to any president. So the fact is, there is a specific calculation that we base the death clock on. We're not just saying, oh, Donald Trump, you've been bad in some general blurry way. We wanted to find the single calculation that was most damning and most specific. In other words, we looked for the most conservative number. And that number was so damning that, reasonable people will debate. The president's defenders will say, oh, it was China's fault, or it was the World Health Organization, or it was the CDC, or blame individuals, blame anybody but the White House. Well, they can do that. Trump's detractors will point to things that happened much earlier, like that his team disbanded the White House Pandemic Directorate in 2018 and got rid of people chiefly concerned with this kind of outbreak. Or they might have pointed to, they want to say, well, in January and February, the intelligence services gave the president countless warnings about the need to move quickly. That is all true, and reasonable people can debate that, but they can debate it till they're not reasonable. We wanted a single calculation, and that's the basis of the Trump death clock, which just looks at one period around which there is no debate, and that is the period between March 9 and March 16. And after Dr. Fauci and others made clear that they acknowledge that mitigation guidelines were not put in when they should have been, the question is, okay, what was the cost of that? Because when a virus is spreading exponentially, as viruses do, every second counts. And in my view, every life counts. So the question is, the seconds that you lost, Mr. President, while you dithered. Look at South Korea. South Korea, at that same moment that we were beginning to see the outbreak of this, they instituted mitigation guidelines, and they ended up with 300 deaths to our 70, 80,000. So you're in a position where the enormity of the mistake, Donald Trump made a political calculation. Whatever his reasoning was, he made a bet. The bet failed. It was a failure. At what cost? And at what cost being borne by the American people?
We're talking to Eugene Jarecki, who has just erected the Trump death clock in Times Square. Eugene, have you gotten response from the administration?
We have not heard from the administration. Most of what we've heard from, frankly, are from people who are detractors of the president who wish that we had used a higher number. They say your death clock only shows that the administration is sort of attributable to 60% of the death toll in America, because that's what it shows. Basically, Doctors Jewell and Jewell, in the piece they published in the New York Times and in other releases of their findings, said had the president and his team moved on March 9, rather than March 16, 60% of American lives would have been saved. That's a harrowing statistic. That puts us today, at this moment, at 48,337 deaths could have been averted had mitigation guidelines been put in place earlier. To me, that is damning enough. And to try to go earlier and enter the debate, the big echo chamber of hyperbolic claims that'll go in both directions, they may even have truth in them. But the president will try to use that to get out of accountability. The goal here is to require accountability, to demand it. Amy, thousands of people lost their lives needlessly, and in their name, we must demand not just accountability, but more responsible and more responsive leadership going forward.
Let me go to the Trump coronavirus calendar that was produced by the recount and captures those months of downplaying and denial before President Trump pivoted to coronavirus crisis mode. It begins on January 22nd.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China. We think we have it very well under control. We pretty much shut it down coming in from China. You know, in April, supposedly it dies with the hotter weather. When it gets warm, historically, that has been able to kill the virus. People are getting better. They're all getting better. And the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear, and you'll be fine. They're going to have vaccines, I think, relatively soon. Not only the vaccines, but the therapies. Therapies is sort of another word for cure. You're talking about very small numbers in the United States. Our numbers are lower than just about anybody. It's really working out, and a lot of good things are going to happen. And we are responding with great speed and professionalism. It's going to go away. Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all. We're going to all be great. We're going to be so good. This came up, we came up so suddenly. This is a pandemic. I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. All you had to do is look at other countries. The coronavirus, you know that, right? Coronavirus. This is their new hoax. We're 15 people in this massive country, and because of the fact that we went early, we could have had a lot more than that. We're doing great. Our country is doing so great.
So, there you have President Trump in that lead-up. He who repeatedly says that he was the first to institute that Chinese travel ban. But if that is true in late January, the question is, where was the gearing up for the tests and where was the gearing up for making the personal protective equipment that so many in hospitals all over this country, not to mention people all over the country in general, need masks? Why wasn't that begun at that time? Clearly a life-saving measure. Now you have, to this day, President Trump and his new press secretary mocking the need for massive testing in this country. But we see over the weekend, with 3 people very close to the White House testing positive for COVID, but that what the president and the vice president are saying is we're getting tested every day and everyone is being tested regularly there, which seems like a perfect model for how the rest of the country should be, that we also should be able to have access regularly to tests, especially as the country reopens. Eugene Jarecki, your final comments on what this means going forward.
Well, the president is conducting himself like an emperor. You know, this is where we see the breakdown of American democracy. And Donald Trump is sort of the epitome of what it looks like when you no longer have a democratic process at work. In a democratic process, you have a separation of powers, let alone between the branches. And then within those branches, there are experts who are brought in to represent areas of public policy with all that they have learned and all that they know from the full time they devote to it. Donald Trump steps in, and like any sort of would-be despot, I've seen a very funny clip on Trevor Noah where Trevor Noah compares the way that Donald Trump speaks about his brain and how smart he is and how great he is and how everything he does is great and nothing he does is wrong and everything is working in the country. That delusionary speak that he engages himself in, Trevor Noah compares that to Idi Amin, literally shows clips back and forth between the African dictator and Donald Trump, back and forth, back and forth. And it just makes clear we are dealing with a person who thinks he's a dictator, and we're dealing with a person whose dictatorial leanings have caused a massive human death toll in this country, as dictators often do, and as democracies are supposed to protect against. When you reject the experts and you make yourself the focus of everything, you screw up, like the president did here, and the Trump death clock is meant to hold him accountable and demand a better path forward.
Eugene Jarecki, I want to thank you so much for being with us, award-winning documentary filmmaker, author, activist who created the Trump Death Clock website and the billboard that's been unveiled in New York City's Times Square. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is working with as few people on site as possible. The majority of our amazing team is working from home. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sharina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Tay Marie Astudio, John Hamilton, Rabi, Karen, Hani Massoud, Adriano Contreras, and Maria Taracena. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Dennis Moynihan, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Gran, David Prude. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.